Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea's sudden addition to the sensitive and other designated countries list by the U.S. Department of Energy has sent shockwaves through diplomatic and security circles. While Seoul insists the move is a technical security measure, critics argue it signals deeper concerns, potentially over nuclear technology proliferation, political instability, or shifting U.S. strategic priorities. The timing is also notable, as this designation was quietly made in the final stretch of the Biden administration, but was only uncovered months later, just as President Trump stepped back into office. So could this designation reshape U.S. South Korea relations moving forward? To break down the key questions at hand, to my left, we have Hans Schattle, professor of political science at Yonsei University. Welcome, Professor.
Hi, Mok-yeon. Nice to see you.
And also to my right is Min Jung-hoon, professor at Korean National Diplomatic Academy with us. Thank you.
My pleasure, always.
Thank you. Now let's begin our discussion with Professor Schattle. So we hear that the U.S. Department of Energy added South Korea to its list of sensitive countries. Could you explain for us, for starters, what exactly is this list, and what kind of economic and security implications does this designation actually have?
Sure, Mok-yeon, and a lot of people, including myself, have been asking for the last few days, what exactly is this list and what does it mean? The acting U.S. ambassador to South Korea, Joseph Yoon, said he was not even familiar with this list until this story broke a few days ago. And I admit the same. I also had not heard of this before. But apparently what it means is that several countries on a regular basis, right now there's about 25 countries on the list, and this is kept by the U.S. Department of Energy, and they are essentially tagged as sensitive countries, which does not shut down cooperation with these countries. And the U.S. Energy Department spokespersons have been very careful to emphasize that South Korea, from the DOE's point of view in the U.S., remains a Tier 1 country when it comes to science and technology cooperation. But this listing means that anyone, the way I understand it anyway, is that anyone who goes into one of the Department of Energy affiliated labs, and there are a lot of them in the U.S., there are a couple of hundred of these labs, for anyone to go into one from South Korea now, there'll just be an additional layer of checking and scrutiny. And apparently a lot of people from South Korea, students and government workers and researchers, visit these labs on an annual basis. Ambassador Yoon today, I think, said there are about 2,000 people from Korea that typically will go into these year to year. So, you know, there's an extra layer of monitoring again, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there would be less actual cooperation or visits. It remains to be seen. But of course, there's also the question as to how South Korea got designated and how long it might stay on that list, if at all.
So it's just a means of having another checkup, another monitoring for South Korean
as it's
people.
Been explained to us, yes.
So, but the South Korean government has said in response to this that this is due to, it's unrelated to foreign policy issues. But there are going analysis suggesting that this is a precautionary measure driven by concerns over nuclear proliferation. What's your view on this, Professor Min?
Yes, and first of all, I'm personally very glad to hear the South Korean government's statements that it happened because of the mishandling sensitive information during the exchanges between the science research institutions under the DOE. But there are still some experts who speculate that growing domestic debates over nuclear armament in South Korea could affect the decision. It is known that the Biden government was very strict about the nuclear non-proliferation, so it seems that it was uncomfortable when there was growing voices in South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons. During its term in office, the Biden government tried to control South Korea's intention to go nuclear by enhancing its cooperation about the extended deterrence against North Korea and the trilateral cooperation between South Korea, U.S., and Japan. But the situation has changed after losing the presidential election in last November. And I think, and many of the experts speculate that the Biden government wanted to have a safeguard against South Korea's enhancing its nuclear capabilities with the next U.S. government, because the incoming Trump government could be more flexible in terms of allowing South Korea to improve its nuclear capabilities. So overall, I think that this sensitive country happening provide South Korea with a good momentum to start off serious discussions about what options, like the having its own nuclear capabilities, or placing the U.S. The tactical weapons, the nuclear weapons onto the South Korean territory, some other options could be necessary and useful for South Korea against North Korea's growing nuclear capabilities. So I think it's about time to talk about what options could be the best for South Korea's future against North Korea's nuclear threats.
So there are a lot of speculations about why this South Korea has been enlisted. Now there are also some voices that say South Korea's unstable domestic political situation has also attributed to the decision. What's your perspective on this, Professor?
Well, first of all, Mok-yeon, we have to kind of take the U.S. ambassador, the acting ambassador, Joseph Yoon, at his word when he says it was simply an issue of mishandling of sensitive information during an apparent visit to one of the labs last year. But on the other hand, I think one reason we see the continued speculation and I think continued public concern about this and debate is the timing happens to coincide with the aftermath of Yoon Suk-yeol's declaration of martial law in December, and then his suspension and impeachment from power after the National Assembly vote in December. So now remember that President Yoon signed an agreement with President Biden in 2023, well, 2 years ago now, just about, promising that South Korea would not pursue its own nuclear weapons program. This was a few months after Yoon had made some statements suggesting that perhaps South Korea would pursue nuclear weapons. And that resulted in the meeting between Biden and Yoon, and the two of them agreed that South Korea would remain under the U.S. nuclear umbrella and not pursue nuclear weapons, and there would be more collaboration with the U.S. as a result. So a whole framework was put in place there. But then the U.S. was, I think, taken by surprise, at least by the comments we have seen from U.S. diplomats in the past few months. Nobody from the Yoon government, even though we were surprised here in Seoul, Washington was also extremely surprised that Yoon would take that step. So that made him seem a bit less reliable to the American side, I suspect. And also then, if President Yoon doesn't come back to office, if the Constitutional Court sustains the impeachment, and then there's a new president coming in, an election and so forth, some of the candidates may very well choose to take South Korea in a different direction when it comes to nuclear weapons. Even Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hoon has recently now, who's a national figure in the Conservative Party politics, he is now openly advocating for South Korea to take on nuclear weapons. We continue to see public opinion polling showing quite a bit of support for South Korea to have its indigenous nuclear weapons. And then alongside all this, as Professor Min pointed out, President Donald Trump now is in power in the U.S., and he may very well turn out to have a different view on nuclear proliferation among allies than previous presidents. So there's a lot that's up in the air. But all of those questions are probably going to be there anyway, whether there's a sensitive country designation or not. So whether that sensitive country designation will stay on the books or not, again, that's a subject, I suppose, for the two countries to discuss as well.
Right. But speaking of timing of this designation, it took us by surprise because the designation came under the last few months of Biden's term, and Biden had been, highlighting, consistency of the bilateral alliance between the two countries, between South Korea and the U.S. How do you think this latest designation would have an impact on future Seoul-Washington alliance? Maybe
not very much. You never know. The Trump people could lift this designation if there was any concern about nuclear non-proliferation issues that led the U.S. to put South Korea in this category. If President Trump then has a somewhat different view on this, then who knows how that could translate into a status ranking from the Department of Energy later on. Or if it's, say the ambassador is correct, and I think we have to assume that Ambassador Yoon's comments are correct, if it really was an issue of mishandling data or mishandling information or somehow sensitive information potentially leaking out of the lab, there were some news stories suggesting that as well this week, then the question would be, well, what has to happen in the relationship, or what has to happen from the Department of Energy's usual guidelines to take South Korea off the list? Like, let's say that's actually the cause. Well, as far as we know, there'll still be visits from Korean students and researchers and government officials, but now there'll be an extra layer of caution. How long will that go on? How long will that extra layer be there before the U.S. decides, okay, we don't need to have that layer of caution? So I've wondered, reading the news coverage, if it's almost like once a country like South Korea gets on that list, are they basically just under probation? And then after a year where there's no more incidents, they'll be taken off, if the incident was actually the cause. But it is worth noting that it's unusual for a U.S. ally to be in this category. Most of the countries that are in this category are not exactly U.S. allies. On the other hand, South Korea is in an interesting position where it's a U.S. ally that's also been openly debating in public whether to acquire its own nuclear weapons, with all the implications that would carry for its current positioning on the non-proliferation treaty. So whenever a country is pursuing its own nuclear weapons program after previously having long been a party to a non-proliferation treaty, that's a very big deal. And I think that's why the Biden administration was so concerned about this.
So, like Professor Schattle said, the length of how long South Korea would be on that list would be also very important to watch. Now, mentioning this, Professor Min, what kind of measures do you think South Korea could take to address this issue?
Well, as far as the reason is, the reason of the designation is the mishandling the information by the South Korean researchers and students, then I think the countermeasure by South Korean government is that it needed to make sure that it will make a consistent effort that South Korean, the counterparts like researchers and students would be more cautious and should be handle sensitive information properly, following the rules, principles, and procedures set by the United States. And I think South Korea will also need to communicate with the Department of Energy regularly to enhance scientific cooperation between the two countries and improve the mutual understanding about it. And last but not least, it is true that it is inevitable for South Korean government to humbly accept the criticism of diplomatic shortcomings, because it didn't recognize that kind of designation for about 2 months. It should never happen.
Right.
And the other South Korean diplomacy. But anyway, I think that personally, South Korean government could not check everything regularly in the Department of Energy, although they regularly communicate with each other. So, and making and updating the list of the sensitive countries is like an internal guideline for people in the department and each laboratories. So it's like the humble excuse, but it could not be easy for South Korea to check such guidelines regularly. But now South Korea fully recognizes the existence of the list and reaching out the U.S. counterpart to remove South Korea out of the list. It's a matter of time before South Korea to exclude itself out of the list, I think.
Right. So when we actually have negotiations to remove South Korea out of the list, do you think the Trump administration would bring out tariffs and defense cost sharing and other bilateral issues while negotiating?
Well, personally, I don't think that Trump government, although he likes the take advantage of all possible means to make more profits, but I don't think that Trump government will take advantage of the list as a leverage for negotiation with South Korea. Basically, I think the decision was made by the previous Biden government, and therefore I think President Trump does not like it. And actually, I don't think that President Trump recognized the existence of list. I don't think that he knows about it. And in addition, Trump government could be more flexible about its nuclear energy policies and want to utilize nuclear energy more actively for its own economic interests. So personally, I think that there is a possibility that Trump government wants South Korean companies to improve its cooperation with the U.S. counterparts, like the Westinghouse, to take projects in nuclear energy industry together. So I expect that designating South Korea as a sensitive country will not last long, and the two countries will continue to enhance their cooperation in the fields of advanced science.
So we would have some possibility to be removed from the list as soon as possible. Now, amid this situation, Professor, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's planned visit to South Korea had been canceled, and South Korea had been excluded from his tour of U.S. military bases and of allied nations in the Indo-Pacific region. What might be the reason behind this?
Yeah, honestly, I wasn't overly surprised to hear this, and I'm not even sure if the visit was fully etched in stone. I know it had been talked about. I know that South Korea was interested in having Pete Hegseth visit during this time period. At least the acting president was hoping for that. My guess, and again, it's just a guess reading the news coverage, but my guess is one consideration might be that not only is there an acting president rather than an actual official fully serving president right now in South Korea, but there's also just an acting defense minister as well. Keep in mind, after President Yoon's martial law decree in December, one of the first people to go was the defense minister at the time, and that defense minister has still not been fully replaced. So possibly for the U.S. defense secretary who's fully installed to come to South Korea only to have an acting defense secretary, there might have been some sort of protocol issue that prompted that. And besides, there are an awful lot of opportunities for the defense secretary to make subsequent visits as well. Lloyd Austin, who was Joe Biden's secretary of defense at the end of the presidency, he also dropped a visit that was planned to South Korea right after the martial law decree. So from my mind, these are some of the consequences that happen when a country goes through some political uncertainty. I will add, however, that a lot of the status quo does remain in place within the two countries. First of all, the U.S. and even the Pentagon spokesperson, at the same time as the Pentagon spokesperson was discussing to the media the agenda for the trip and the fact that South Korea was not part of it, the Pentagon, of course, still maintained that the relationship between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea remains ironclad. I think that was the word they've been using, not only in that news conference, but frequently. The messaging from the U.S., which has been very interesting because there's a lot of uncertainty right now about U.S. allies and their relationship to the U.S. and to Washington under Trump. But so far, the messaging from multiple parts of the U.S. executive branch has been that the status quo is in place and that the alliance is strong. The trilateral partnership, which Professor Min referred to earlier, between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S., again, there were questions as to whether that would survive. The transfer of power in the U.S. There's also a new Japanese prime minister as well. President Yoon, his fate is still uncertain. But so far, the trilateral meetings have been continuing. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with the foreign minister of South Korea and also his counterpart from Japan, the foreign minister of Japan, at the recent security gathering summit in Munich, Germany. And there have been lower-level trilateral meetings as well. And the national security advisor from South Korea has met his American counterpart, so has the trade minister. So at a lot of working level and even cabinet-level positions, there is still a lot of dialogue going on. And yes, I mean, it's conspicuous that the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense is not coming on this trip, but there seem to be some reasons for it and some opportunities for further dialogue later.
Right. It could be influenced by the current political turmoil, but officially there had been no statements on the ironclad alliance. Now, Professor Min, during former President Park Geun-hye's administration's impeachment crisis, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and Vice President all visited South Korea in succession. Given this precedent, how some still worry that Hegseth's canceled visit signals a resurgence of the so-called Korea passing phenomenon. What's your take on this?
Well, personally, I don't think that South Korea has been passed by Trump government. As you know, after taking upon the office, Trump government is very busy and dealing with various agendas based on its priorities. And among the policy agendas, overcoming inflation through energy policy and federal government's reform, coping with illegal immigration by securing southern border and massive deportation, reducing trade deficits through tariffs, and ending Russian-Ukraine war by the dual-track negotiations. I think these issues are included at the top of the agenda list. So personally, I think that South Korea, luckily, has a little to do with these agendas, except trade issues. And specifically in the issue of reducing trade deficits, South Korea is ranked about 8th in terms of the volume of the trade surplus with the U.S., followed by China, Mexico, Canada, EU, and Japan. And so far, Trump government has targeted the top 3 countries and EU, and I think so it's about time to touch upon its Asian partners like South Korea and Japan. So President Trump mentioned about South Korea when he talked about reciprocal tariffs in his address to a joint session of Congress recently. So I expect that Trump government is going to be more aggressive in its relations with South Korea, like pushing hard to reduce its trade deficit. And I also think that after the political turmoil in South Korea is over, it is very likely that Trump government will also ask South Korea to resume SMA negotiation like the burden sharing negotiations again and request South Korea to pay more the defense cost. So I think it's not a time to worry about Korea passing. Instead, I think it is the time to take actions for South Korea not to be placed at the top of the list and secure its interests against the Trump government's aggressive moves.
Right. Prepare for strategies in terms of economic policies. Now, meanwhile, President Trump recently referred to North Korea as a nuclear power and a nuclear armed state. He also said that he will seek a relationship with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Professor Schattle, do you think this could signal a fundamental shift in terms of Washington's policy on North Korea?
Well, I wish a reporter at the press availability at the White House where Trump made those statements had asked a follow-up question, because U.S. policy has been consistently not to recognize North Korea as a nuclear armed state. Now, even if there's a kind of tacit recognition that North Korea possesses nuclear weapons, and of course it went through a period of extensive testing of them during the last decade, officially the U.S. has not extended that kind of recognition. Trump's language in the offhand comments, seems to match up with the kind of language that would suggest recognition. And also Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made a similar comment around the time that he was also getting ready to take office in January, using the term nuclear power. So that has caused some speculation. I think eventually it will come down to what kind of diplomacy the Trump administration chooses to pursue with North Korea. Again, Trump in the same press availability last week made it clear that he's very keen to talk again with Kim Jong-un. He seems to have had a kind of bromance, so to speak, with Kim during the last round of summitry in 2018 and 2019. But again, it's really important to remember that the stated aim of that earlier round of diplomacy, the stated purpose from the U.S. point of view on those summits, as it was communicated at the time, was denuclearization. In fact, Trump only agreed to have the summits and move forward with them once he heard from a visiting South Korean delegation, this was during the Moon Jae-in presidency, that they had heard from Kim Jong-un that he was ready to pursue denuclearization. Unfortunately, at that time period, there was, I don't think, ever any full clarification on all sides what was meant by full denuclearization of North Korea. I think for North Korea, they had one view of denuclearization that involved a diminished U.S. presence. I think the U.S. point of view, the way it was negotiated at the time, seemed to emphasize North Korea denuclearizing on its own before other corresponding measures would be taken. Since then, many foreign policy analysts have said it's going to be very difficult to expect North Korea ever to denuclearize, hence all the debates about nuclear proliferation that we're seeing here in South Korea. So again, this is all to be determined. But again, finally, the U.S. keeps stating in its policy documents and at press conferences since Trump has taken office that denuclearization of North Korea remains the policy at this moment in time.
Right. So despite his languages and adjectives, he's been consistently saying that Washington's policy remains as towards denuclearization of North Korea, right?
Right, for now, but things can change. You never know.
Right, we'll have to see. So with South Korea's sudden designation as a sensitive country and uncertainty over U.S. policy shifts, the road ahead remains unpredictable, and how Washington and Seoul would navigate these developments will be key in shaping the future of their alliance. We'll have to continue to monitor the situation closely, but for now, we'll have to end our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Schattle.
Thank you for having me, Mok-yeon.
And Professor Min.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.